Hello everyone, welcome back to part 3 of our Unity UI tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about animators and animations. So let's just jump right into it. So I've got my Unity project that we've been working with so far. I've cleaned out everything except for my canvas, my event system, and I still have my game logic left over from last time, but we're not going to worry about that right now. It's not really doing much anyway. So I still have my button prefab left over from last time as well. So I'm going to start out by dragging in that button prefab to my canvas. Um, as you may remember, we set this up to have some color tint transitions on the button. And we're going to be looking at changing these transitions from the color tints to animations. So we can go ahead and just look at what that looks like right now. You can see we've got this, the highlighted state, the pressed state, the selected state, and the normal state. Now, if we exit play mode here, I'm going to go to this button. So when we change our transition to animation, you can see we've got these particular triggers which match to particular named states. And we also are given this auto generate animation button. Now, if we change this over to here, we're not going to get anything in terms of functionality right now because we don't have an animator set up or animations actually set up. We only have these states, these triggers and state names set up right now. And if I go to my animator screen, you'll see there's nothing. Even though I have the button highlighted, there is no animator component or animator controller, so we're not seeing anything yet. So now when I go ahead and I click auto generate animation, we're going to get this little pop-up asking us where do we want to create a new animation controller. Now I usually put all of my animations inside the art folder. I usually make a subfolder called animation. And then sometimes, depending, I'll even split this out into controllers and animations. We'll look at that separation in a little bit. For right now, I'm just going to click save right in here, and we'll save this as button animation controller. Hit save. Okay, and so now if we look in our project setup down here, you can see we have our button animation controller, and nested under the button animation controller, we have 5 different animations for the different button states. If we've got our button selected, and so now if we look at the animator window, you'll see we have all of these different states, the 5 different states that were listed in the button. And on each of these states, there is a motion which is tied to the actual animation for that state. So you can see normal's got normal, the highlighted's got highlighted, all of that. So this was auto-generated when we clicked the, I guess it's gone now because I've already clicked it, but the auto-generate animations button, when we clicked that, this is what it created. The animation controller, 5 different animations, and 5 different animation states linked to those animations. Now, in addition, it has also created transitions to those states, these little white lines going from any state to each state. These are transitions. It also created parameters. So we'll get into all of these different things in a bit. Let's see where we're going to start with. We're going to start with the we'll start with the states. Okay, so as I said, each of these states is paired to an animation. The orange state, this is what we're saying is, you can see we have a line coming from the entry. This is the entry point for our animation, and sort of when we play the scene, the animator component is going to transition to a default state right off the bat. And that's what this entry to default state as marked in orange, that's what you're seeing here. We can right click on any other state and set the layer as the default state, and you'll see it will change that transition. This transition, the default transition, you can see it doesn't have any options on it, because essentially when we start the gameplay, we're just going to jump straight to whatever state that is. There is no, there's no transition from starting to that state. It's just from 0 straight into the state. So I'm going to go ahead and set that back to normal for right now as our default state. So if we look over here, what we're going to see is a couple different options. So again, first the motion, which is the actual animation itself. We see a speed, which is how fast are we going to run that animation. A speed of 1 is essentially 100%. So when we're working with the animations, we're going to define keyframes, and based off of where we place those keyframes, that will determine how long that animation takes to run. Setting the speed acts as a multiplier. So if I set this to 2, the animation will run twice as fast. And if I set it to 0.5, the animation will run half as fast. So speed is just a multiplier. It's not a fixed number of seconds or anything like that. We also have some other parameters in here. There's a lot of complex logic and different options that you can get into with your animations. For now, the only things that we're really going to focus on are which animation are we playing and how fast are we playing it. So if we jump to one of our other animations, you can see we've got all those same, the motion is different, or sorry, one of our other states, the animation paired to that state is different. All of the other options are kind of the same, and everybody starts out with that speed of 1. So even with these right now, if we press play, if we go back to our scene, we're not going to see anything, because now we've set up the animations. We've set up the animation controller. We've set up the animations. We've set up the states within the animation controller to be paired to certain animations, but we haven't edited the animations at all. So right now, all of our 5 animations are totally blank. And so you can see when I click on this, I'm still getting, you can see the click logic from our previous tutorial is still being registered. It's counting my clicks, but I'm not getting any kind of a visual change with those button states like we were getting before. So now we're going to jump into the animation frame. So if you don't already have it open, you can go to Window, Animation, Animation, and I'm going to go ahead and drop this panel into our main view. Actually, yeah, I'll drop it into the main view here. So now, in order to actually see, I'm going to hit stop, by the way. So one thing here, you don't actually need to stop your project when working with animations for the most part, because all of these assets, they live in the project. Unlike components, where those changes that you make to your components, they don't persist when you exit play mode. Changes to animations, because they're not scene-based but project-based, the changes that you make to animations can actually they will persist after you exit play mode. So you can tweak these things inside of play mode. For right now, we're going to just kind of stay outside of it. It's a little bit easier to see things. So when we jump over to the animation screen, right, you might think that, oh, I can click on this animation controller and I'll see animations. Nope. You might think that you could click on the animation, you'll see the animation. Well, kind of, but you're not actually able to edit it or add any properties. So an animation is basically defining the set of properties on a game object that you are going to alter when the animation is played. So in order to add properties, we actually need to know what is the game object that we're going to be animating. So to get this editable, we have to click on the button in our hierarchy, and now it will allow us to preview the different animations that are attached to, oh, and actually I didn't show this, I should show this. When we asked it to auto create the animator, it added this animator component to our button game object, our prefab. Again, that's why you see the little plus screen here, little plus button. So it added the animator component to this game object, and it automatically linked the controller property to that button animation controller that it created. So now that we've got this animator component with a controller on our button, when we click the button, we get access to the animations inside of the button animator controller. So we're able to look at these different animations and then add properties for each one. So when I hit add property, you can see you're going to get this little flyout menu. This is a list of every component on the game object, every child game object of the game object, and every component on every child game object. In addition to that, if you break out components, you're able to see every property, or at least the ones that you're able to animate, every animatable property on that component. So just through this, access to the button, the top level button game object with this animator component, we're able to see all of these properties on all of the, the components and subchild components of this game object. So again, the animation component it's very powerful. It gives you a lot of access for editing a lot of different fields, either simultaneously or in different animations. So in this case, what I'm going to do for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to start out by editing the rect transform component. So now I'm going to open out my rect transform component, and we're going to play with the scale property of this component. So right now I'm in the normal, and really, we don't necessarily really want to edit the properties on the normal state of the button when no one's interacting with it. It probably should just be regular, but maybe we want to draw some attention to it or something. So let's go ahead and we're going to set this up so that when the button is in its normal state, it will lightly pulse up and down, or kind of in and out with a scale. So what we're going to do, you can see by default, we've got all the scale properties set at 1, and our animation length is set to 60 frames. Again, we're running at 60 frames per second. So this is 1 second's worth of animation from frame 0 to frame 60. We can come in here. We're going to say at frame 30, we're going to add a new keyframe. So now there are different ways that you can do this, but once you have your timeline at a particular spot, if you make a change to one of these properties, say we scale up to 1 point, and actually, you know what? Let's scale down first. We're going to scale it down to 0.8, so 80% of the size on the X and the Y axes. I'm going to drag the animation panel over to the side, and we're actually, let's see, I'm going to close things out a little bit just so we can get a little bit better view. Let's see if I drag this over a bit, if we can kind of see everything at the same time. And scale the view down so that we can see all of our frames. Okay, there we are from 0 to 60. And you'll notice in this top left here, there's this preview button. This is off, when it's looking a little bit lighter, this means it's selected. So preview is now on, and you'll notice when I turned it on and off, we saw this change in the game view. The button is changing its scale. So it's showing us the preview of our animation here because I have this, our playhead is currently at 30 frames, and the scale is 0.8, so we're seeing that reflected in the game view here. You can also see it in the, you'll see it in the scene view as well. Either of these views will, you know, reflect the changes that you're making. You can preview either way. So now when I drag this, you'll see we're gonna see the animation on these properties in our scene or our game views. So we're starting at a scale of 1, it's going down to a scale of 0.8 and back up to a scale of 1. And that's the normal state on the button. So when we play, because that's the default state, we're going to enter into the scene, and sure enough, there it is. It is now pulsing at us, and it's pulsing in a loop. That is because if we go to our normal animation, we can see the loop time property. This is by default comes as true, at least for the button animations. I can't remember if that's true for all animations. We'll look at that later on in the video. So if I deselect loop time, you'll see that the button should, let's see, why is that still looping? That's surprising. It may need to restart for that to take effect. Okay, so I've stopped. I'm playing again. Loop time is off. We enter, and there we go. Okay, so we got our single pulse when we entered the normal state. It's not looping anymore. So we can go ahead and turn that back on if we want it to continue to kind of pulse at us until we interact with it. And let's see, let's jump back to, we got to select our button again so we can see it. Okay, so this is one way to edit the keyframes. And you'll notice that we're able to click on them. We can, you know, right click on these to get some other options, but these options, these kind of all have to do with the curve of the keyframe or the curve of the animation. And so that is to say, when we're scaling from 1 to 0.8, is this happening in a purely linear way? Are we speeding up at the beginning and then slowing down as we get closer to that target scale? Or is it, you know, or is there some other kind of a curve to the animation? And so now down here you have this curves tab. If we click into the curves tab, you will now see the animation curves for all or each individual property. So now a lot of times, particularly when you're dealing with sort of values that are in very different ranges, right? Our scale value, we're mostly going to be dealing somewhere in the range of, you know, 0 to 1. You know, we have our button probably already sized pretty well to where we want it. And so we're probably not going to be having a scale of 20 on our button. It would just be so massive. But you'll see here, it's really hard to actually see what's happening, this change here, because we're so zoomed out and we're only working in the values around like 0 to 1 to 2. And you can see our scale here is going all the way from -85 up to 10. So the panel, you know, depending on which property you're working with, you are going to need to kind of adjust the zoom so that you're able to see this property a little better. So working and zooming within the animation panel itself, there's a few different things that you can do here, a few different techniques. So by default, if I zoom in and out, you'll see everything is scaling together. It's scaling the y-axis, which is the value, and it's scaling the x-axis, pardon me, which is the duration or the time. So in order to just scale the y-axis, what we do is we hold I believe it's the shift key. We hold the shift key and we start scaling in. Now you'll notice only my y-axis is moving. And as we scale it up, we're able to finally get a little bit more of a view into what's happening. So you can see here we are scaling our button from 1 down to 0.8 and then back up to 1. If we click on an individual property, so right now we're scaling the X and the Y at the exact same rate and to the same scale. Let's go ahead and kind of change this around a little bit. So I'm going to zoom in again, try to get a little bit closer. Okay. So we are at our frame 30. This is the keyframe we are setting the scale in. And I'm going to set the X scale to, let's make it a little wider actually. We want this button to, we're going to squeeze it. We're going to shrink the Y and expand the X together. So we're going to set this up to 1.2. And so now you'll see what's happening. It kind of is stretching this button out, scaling the X up and the Y down. And what you'll see is now when I have two different curves going here. It's a little hard to see with the colors that we've got here, but I'll do my best to try to scale this up so you guys are able to see it. Okay, so you can see we've got a red, a green, and a blue. Over here, those correlate to the colors, you know, of these little diamonds or this oval. These diamonds or ovals, that indicates whether or not there's a keyframe or not a keyframe. You can see everything is an oval if we're not in a keyframe. If we are in a keyframe, it shows that there's a diamond, you know, for that property at that time. So, if we click on an individual property, we will see just the curve for that property. Now, if we click on a keyframe for a property, we're going to see the handles for this property. And so now this curve, right, as of right now, you can see we're going from 1 where it's not quite linear. It's not just a straight line between value A and value B. There's a little bit of smoothing happening. And that's default to Unity. It will, any property that you add in, it adds a little bit of smoothing for your animation. But we can change that. We can, through these handles, right, you can edit what that curve looks like. There's a few different properties that you have access to in terms of how these handles behave. So by default, when I grab one side, it's like a seesaw, and it will affect both sides of this curve. And so we'll see, you know, we'll go ahead and play with this a little bit just to show that some different things. So right now this is kind of, I've tried to make a very linear transition. It's going to scale at a constant rate all the way till it gets to 1. In this case, after it gets on the other side, it's actually, you know, because it's following this handle, it's going to scale up past the 1.2 marker up to a little bit above it, 1.209, and then all the way back down to 1. So now if we look at this, I don't know that we're able to really see much in the way of a difference yet. So let me go ahead and play with this a little further. And now you're going to see we're getting a very different behavior on this animation based off of the animation curve that I'm presenting to it. So these handles, couple different options. Right now you can see when I try to drag on the handle, you know, if you're used to working with a Bezier curve at all, usually you can drag this handle left and right to kind of determine how much this curve should bump out. In order to get that functionality, we need to either, I think it's option click or control click, yeah. So you're gonna right click, control click, whatever it is on your platform to get this pop-out menu for this keyframe. The tangents, if you set these to weighted, they will change to boxes, and you are now able to grab and change the weighting of this handle to, again, affect that curve in very different ways. Additionally, if we want to be able to affect each side without having that seesaw effect, if we select broken, that allows us to affect each side of the animation curve individually. And let's see, I guess, yeah. So a little hard to kind of see when we have these things operating independently. It's a little harder to see. Let me go ahead and real quick, I'm going to jump back to the dope sheet. I'm going to remove the Y So now we're only scaling the x-axis in this animation. I removed the scale for the button's Y scale. So we're only seeing scaling on the x-axis. And so now you can kind of see here, you can see this animation curve. We're going very slow at the beginning and then speeding up and really quick and kind of bouncing in and out of it. And that's, you're seeing here what the effect is, kind of really quick, slow, and then bouncing in and out of the scale up animation. You're able to reset this, through these different options here. So if I set this back to flat, you'll see we go back to, this, the two handles go back to being flat. If we change the tangents, we can change them away from weighted back to linear, constant, free. So you have a lot of different options here around, how to tweak individual curves for animated properties. All right, so let's see. Let's go ahead and pause that for a moment. You can use the space bar to pause and play your animations. In order to navigate around inside of the animation panel, so aside from scaling, that's one of the things we want to do, right? So again, that shift key allows us to scale just the y-axis. The command key will allow us to scale just the x-axis. And then if we release them, then we scale both together. So you have to be very aware of where your playhead is, because wherever the playhead is, if you edit a property, it will place a keyframe. Oops, there we go. It will place a keyframe at wherever the playhead was with that new value. So even though, I'm going to undo here, even though I might have this keyframe selected and then I go and try to change its value to something else, you'll see it doesn't actually affect the keyframe that's selected. It will affect a keyframe, if any, at where your playhead is. And if there's no keyframe there, it will create a new one, right? Beyond that, so with that, right, in order to make sure that you are, not a frame off, right? It's really hard to be able to make sure, am I really at frame 30? Depending on the scaling too, right? If we're zoomed out a little bit, am I at frame 30? Am I at frame 29? Whatever, right? You can see this value here. This shows you what frame you're at. You can jump to it. You can type this in to move, from one keyframe to another. You'll see the playhead updates as I jump from one to another. But, that can be kind of tedious. So another hotkey, in order to navigate between keyframes, you can use the Control key, I believe, and the period and comma buttons. So if I hit Control period, maybe not Control, Option period, yeah, there we go. So it's the Option key on Mac, which I think is the Alt key on Windows. Alt period will jump you to the next keyframe for your selected property. So you can see if I do Alt period, I jump to the next, and Alt comma jumps me to the previous keyframe. So if you already have the positioning set up and what you want to do is tweak the values, using this hotkey to jump between them can be a little bit easier and maybe a little less error prone than trying to drag your playhead to the exact keyframe and hoping that you haven't missed it by one, which is really easy to do. It's really easy to be one off of it and you think you're changing it, and now all of a sudden, instead of changing it, I've got two keyframes right next to each other, and I'm definitely not getting the functionality or the animation that I expected to get. Let me go back. I'm gonna go ahead and change the Y value again. I'm gonna add in this so that we can see when we are looking at multiple properties with keyframes, and I use my shortcut of Option period, it will jump to whatever the next keyframe is of any of the selected properties. If I choose just a particular curve, it will do it only for the selected property. So just something to be aware of when you're editing one property versus all the properties. Okay, so these properties, right? So the keyframes, right? You can affect them. You can affect them through typing in new values. You can drag them around the view. You can hold down the shift key to, or sorry, let's see, maybe it's not the shift key. Yes, the shift key. As you're moving, and actually I think if you hold down the shift key before you grab, it doesn't work. You have to grab it, and then after you've grabbed it and started moving it, press the shift key. It will lock you to either the X or the Y axis for editing that keyframe. So again, I'm going to click down on the keyframe. I'm now clicking the shift key, and I'm now moving up and down. And you'll see, even as I move my mouse left and right, because I started moving this keyframe up and down first while holding the shift key, it is locked to a vertical adjustment. On the flip side, if I hold down on the keyframe, press the shift key, and start moving horizontally, I'm now locked to a horizontal adjustment even when I move my mouse up and down. And it's okay, so I can release that, and now we're able to again edit totally freely. Oh, real quick, you also have controls up here. You're able to record adjustments. So if it's easier for you when you're making your animation, if for some reason you want to record adjustments to properties made in the inspector panel, you can do that. So I can press the record key. You can see it changes red to let me know I'm recording. And if I change some property in here, let's say my X position, if I change my X position, oh, you can see in my animation panel, it's created that keyframe. You can see it created the button anchored position. So it's changing things there. And again, this is the sort of thing where we might have very different scales, right? I maybe want my X, I want to move my X value on my button to 100 pixels, which again, our scale, we were looking at 0 to 1 before. So this is where you kind of end up with properties that can be really out of sync with each other in terms of what is the level of scale that we're looking at. And so for that reason, what you may want to do is, you can, just like make sure you're looking always at one particular property, right? Unfortunately, there's not a good way to jump back and forth between scales. Like like the way that we can double click a game object in our hierarchy and it'll zoom, like jump right to that object and center it in the view. It would be great if that happened for animations, but it doesn't. I can double click this and I don't get any kind of, there's nothing there happening. So it's a very manual process to get back to a particular view for a particular set of animation properties, which is kind of a bummer. But anyway, so changing this value, it'll record any changes to that value. You can change the keyframe that you're on and then change that value again. And again, it makes this keyframe record the changes. You can also do this while, if for whatever reason you needed to, you can do this while it's playing. Obviously, it's very hard to control because it's going to do it at whatever keyframe the frame height was at when you made the adjustment. You can see my button is going real wild now. We'll go ahead and we're going to turn off the record. We're going to turn off the preview, and we are going to go ahead and get rid of that property that we were animating before. And we will kind of get back to something slightly normal here. We'll remove the size delta property as well. And so now we're looking back at our scale, our button scale, and in that range of sort of 0 to 1. So, all right, now we're back looking at something kind of normal. Okay, let's see. Next we're going to talk about transitioning between animations. So right now what we did is we set up an animation that is the default state we're entering it right when we play, and we're looping through that animation. Now, when I mouse over, you'll notice when I mouse over the button, our animation stops playing. That is because we have transitioned to the highlight state of the button, which has an animation associated with it that has no property overrides or anything. So essentially what's happening is it is defaulting to the original properties of the button, because that animation of the highlight animation doesn't have anything on it yet. So, and you can see if we look at our animator, I'm gonna bring the animator panel over to the right also, so that we're able to see these simultaneously. You can see here this represents this moving bar. This represents the animation playing. You can see it's looping, and we're constantly in that normal state. When I mouse over, you will watch it go to the highlighted state. So it draws a little blue highlight on the transition to indicate that the transition is happening, and then it draws the, you can see it changes the state, moves to the highlight state, and now it is currently looping over that highlight animation, which is empty. Now, let's talk about the transitions to these things first. So we've got a couple things here. The triggers, these parameters. There are different parameters that you can set up for your animations. I'm going to stop this so that I can edit this. There are certain things that you can't change while you're in play mode, and adding parameters, I believe, looks like it's one of them. Also, I would note, for accessing the animator, right, so the animation, oh, this is very interesting. I'm amazed it's currently allowing me to like add and edit properties even though I'm not selected onto the button. I guess it's because we already had something, we kind of got something set up, and it's got a few properties in there now, and so now it kind of recognizes what the game object is that we're dealing with. But it's definitely a little finicky in terms of getting back to accessing the animator or the properties sometimes. Yeah, you can see, here we go. I selected the, right. So now I've selected the highlighted animation. I have no ability to add properties. If I select the normal animation, no ability to add properties, but I can see the property that was added. If I click onto the animator controller, still no ability to edit properties, but I am able to get to the animator controller by selecting it, and I can see the states that are inside of it. I can see the transitions, and I can edit those parameters. So, parameter types: float, int, bool, and trigger. Essentially, you have, some very basic conditions that you can use to control transitions between animations. These are parameters specifically for this animation, which you will set through code and then create conditions that work with these different parameters. So by default, again, we brought in our button, we got this whole animation set up by allowing the button to auto-create it. And in doing so, it auto-created 5 trigger parameters. A trigger parameter can be active or inactive, and your transitions, which work with parameters, you can define conditions on a transition. You can, and you are able to, you can see here, this is the list of the different parameters that I have access to. So I've got a new trigger. I'll add a couple other ones in here. We'll do a float. We'll do an int and a bool. That was the bool. There's an int. So as you can see, you're able to affect the initial starting values of these parameters. You're also able to affect them in code by accessing the animator component. So the conditions. you're able to select any of your parameters from this drop-down list. If you have a trigger type parameter, this simply says that if the trigger is active, then this transition is allowed, and it will make that transition from whatever states you've allowed. In this case, we've said any state can transition to any of these states. So no matter what, it can go from disabled to any of them. It can go from selected to any of them. We have a very free-flowing transition process set up right here. So when this condition is true, it will move to the state that's at the other end of the transition. You can see all of these right now. The conditions are all named the same as the states that they go to. Again, a trigger can only be on or off. It's kind of like a bool in that way, except the trigger gets reset when that transition is made. So when we say, let's go ahead and we'll play this, and you can preview some of this stuff here. So we'll watch this with the trigger, right? Even though I'm not gonna do it, let's see if this works. It's not quite showing up the way I would expected. The triggers aren't really fully, let's see, let me change this back to normal. Highlighted, pressed, selected. Yeah, so this all looks right. I'm a little surprised that I'm not seeing usually the triggers will show up in your parameters. You'll be able to see these triggers as they change. I don't know why it's not doing that for us right now. Yeah, it didn't really show it at all. I guess it's just very, very quick. Okay, so usually what you'll see in a trigger is if it's active, there's a little white dot like this. And so actually you can see here, because we have set this trigger to active as the default state, we have this transition with a condition that says if the highlighted trigger is true, allow the transition to highlighted. Then what we do when we play, you'll see it will move to the highlighted state and deactivate that trigger. And now that's just happening so quickly, we're barely able to see it. Let's see. If we take away the transition to the normal state, maybe this will allow us to see it. Nope, it just automatically transitions back there. All right, well, that's a bummer. Not quite working the way that you would expect sometimes, right? That is sort of par for the course with this program, not gonna lie, especially with animations. They're very, very complicated, or at least they can be. Let's see. I think that we are going to, at this point, I think because these animations can be so complicated, and because, using the auto create animations option through your button, we sort of lose a lot of the nuances of how to construct this ourselves. And, a lot of the nuances of what each individual piece does and what's happening. Getting to this state of the auto-created button state, of all of these transitions and everything set up, there's a lot that happened there that we never saw. So what we're gonna actually do is start from scratch and go through the setting up an animator controller and animations from scratch. Because honestly, a lot of times you're gonna be wanting to do animations that aren't on a button, and you won't have that auto-generate animation option because that's only available through button components. So let's go ahead and we're gonna create one from scratch, and you'll see the whole process start to finish. Okay, let's get ourselves back to scratch. we are going to delete this button. I'm going to delete my animation folder with the animator controller and the animations. And now we should be pretty much back to the beginning. I'm going to drag my button component back into my canvas. I'm going to set that transition to be an animation. Actually, you know what? I'm going to set the transition to none. No, okay. I'll do the animation transition, but we are going to manually generate the actual animation itself. Okay, so to create a new animation, there's a few different pieces that we need. I'm going to create a new folder under my art folder called Animator Controllers. And I'm going to create another folder named Animations. Inside of the Animator Controller folder, I'm going to create Animation, Animator Controller, and I will name this Button Animator Controller. You can see here, when I did that, it selected my project view. My animator panel is showing the default animator controller setup, which has a few states that are sort of universal states. Entry, this is just when we start up the scene, when the game object that has this animator on it becomes active, we're going to go from the entry state immediately to whatever we define as the default state. Now, right now we don't have any actual states here. We have the entry state. We have any state, which literally means that when we have states in here, this is a placeholder to represent any of those available states. And then we also have the exit state, which simply means that when you can have an animation that when the animation is done, it will go to the exit state, and then it will loop back around automatically back to the entry state after going to an exit state. So, but we don't have any states in between, and that's what that's what we need. We're not able to make a transition from entry to exit. No, you can't make a transition from any of these states to another state. You need to actually create a new state in order to allow transitions. So we right click, create state, empty. We get a new state. This state, it truly doesn't exist in our project view anywhere. It only exists inside of this button animator controller asset in the project, right? So we have a new state. We can change the name of this state in our inspector. We can call this, let's see, we're going to do this for our button. So we're going to call this default. This will represent the default state of our button. Motion, it has no motion assigned to it yet. That's where we will place an animation. And the speed is 1, and the rest of these, mostly these have to do with if you are creating animations on more complex objects like 3D models and things like that. Things that have motion in addition to having an animation, the object is moving through the game world in time with that animation, like a running animation. That's kind of where those other properties come into play. So we don't need to worry about those for right now. But for right now, we do have our default state, which just by adding it, it became our default state, I believe, right? When we add a new state, yes, it shows up in orange. It creates this linkage from entry to new state. Again, I'll call this default. And if I right click, you'll see set layers default state is grayed out because that has already occurred automatically by creating a new state in the animator controller, and it's the only state. It's the first state and the only state. So that's default. Let's create another state. We're going to call this one I guess we'll call it pressed, or maybe we'll call it down for the sake of demonstrating how to link these things up. So we've got default and we've got down for our button. Those are the only two things it can be. It can be up, it could be down. We're not going to worry about the highlight, the pressed, or the selected for right now. We can make a transition from any state to down. We can make a transition from any state to default. So what this says is when our component first becomes active, it will go from entry to default. When we set up a transition that has certain conditions and allows it to transition from any state to down and from any state back to the default. So now we're going to set up the conditions under which we want our animator to trigger a specific animation. So you can see this transition needs at least one condition or an exit time to be valid. So we're going to start out by creating a condition. We'll create a trigger condition. A trigger, again, it can be on or off. That's on, that's off. And when it is on, if at the point that the transition, that this trigger is sort of used to make a transition, the trigger turns from on to off. So it's like a bool, except it will automatically revert back to false when the transition is made. So this is going to be our down trigger, and we'll create another one. Actually, you know what? We can use this one trigger, down trigger. It's either true or it's actually, well, we'll see. We'll see what happens when we try to use a single trigger to handle the up and down logic for our button. So create a transition, down trigger. When down trigger is active, like so, it will allow us to move from any state to the down state. And we're going to say, you'll notice you can't say when the trigger is false. You only have the ability to say if the trigger is true, then move to this state. So when we move to our down state, we need to have an animation associated with that state. So let's create a new animation. Create animation clip. This is in our animations folder. This is a new animation. We're going to call this button down. And if we click over to our animation, again, we have to, in order to get access to the properties, it needs to know what object we're animating. So we click on the button, and we need to add a component, the animator component, and we need to link that component to our button animator controller. And now, let's see. Transition will be ignored. That's okay, I think. I'm surprised that we're not seeing access to begin. Create an animation clip. Our button animator controller has the down state. Oh, no motions. Right. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I didn't assign the animation yet. I'm assigning the button down animation to the down state. Now, when I look back at my animation panel, you can see I have the button down animation. That's referring to this animation here, this asset is available for editing in the project. I can add a property. I will change the button fill color from, you know what? So what we'll do is we will ask it to immediately switch to red. And then we will ask it to, right, by default, it's going to fade. We had, fading back to white because these default values were all populated with 1, which was the color of the button initially. White, all ones. And we'll ask it to go to, let's say we want to go to green. So our button down at the beginning, it should turn red immediately. And then it will transition its color to green. The button down animation is not looped. And so what we should see is, all right, let's see how this works. So now I'm pretty sure what we're going to have is the down trigger is not going to fire because it's not paired up by name to our button triggers. So even though I'm getting the down state, I'm clicking on it, we're seeing it here. You can see actually the parameters don't exist. It's throwing some warnings for us that we don't have these parameters set up yet. I'm going to change the pressed trigger to down trigger, and now there you go. Now we are getting that animation on the button. Now you'll notice even after this animation completes, it stays there, right? It doesn't go back to anything else, and that's because we don't have a transition back to our default state. We're not able to set a down trigger. We're not able to set a condition here. We don't have another parameter yet. We don't have a valid condition to move it back to default. We could make a transition to default like this and just say that because we've made this transition, what we're saying is that when this animation, the down animation finishes, it will automatically, conditions list is empty, right? There's no conditions. It's just a transition that is allowed. It will then transition to the default state. And so what we should see, yep, there we go. So now we're seeing that in our animator controller, right? We click down, we see it go, and it goes back. Now, it's going back to the default state, but the default state doesn't have any animation with it. So what we'll do is we'll make a new animation for our default state. Animation, animation clip, and we'll call this button default. We go to our default state. We hook up our button default. Our button default animation doesn't have any properties or anything like that. And so now, let's see. I guess what happens here is because we are not setting the property back to anything, it maintains the overridden property from the previous animation, right? So the default state has a default animation. If we look in the animation, we have no properties. If we want to add a property, button fill, image, color, we'll set this to 1 all the way around, and we don't even need to transition anything. We can just say, set it to 1. There's not even a real animation here. It's just a single frame, set it back to white, right? And so now, what we should see in our button animation, let's see, now we're not getting anything on the button, huh? Oh, the animator component turned off. How'd that happen? Okay. There we go. So now we are seeing I'm going to click and just hold on the button. And what you're seeing is that automatic transition through the down state and then back to default. Notice over here, notice the highlights on these white lines. It transitions to the down state, completes the animation, and then automatically transitions back to default. Actually, so let's see. There's some other things that are happening here that are, you might notice, it's not actually getting all of the way to the end of the down state. You'll notice that this, it's very subtle, but you'll notice when our animation bar gets to around 75%, we're going to see this transition light up. Ready? There it is. I don't know if you see that. Right around 75%, all of a sudden it transitions away. And that's because this transition has been given an exit time of 0.75, which means that in order to make this transition, we need to wait for 75% of the state that we're coming from, the down state. We need to wait for 75% of that animation to finish. And so actually, let me see if we can illustrate this even a little better. What I'll do in my button down, I'm going to, so we're going red. What we're going to say, in fact, is we're going to say we're red all the way until frame 45, 75%. So I've copied and pasted the red color keyframe at 45, which is, of course, 45 out of 60 is 75%. And then it's supposed to make its color transition. However, again, what we're allowing is for this transition to occur at 75%. And so what we should see here, if we can get back, we've gotten out of this, we've gotten out of a valid clickable state for whatever reason here. Let's see, sometimes this happens. I think maybe we're previewing here. Is that the issue? There we go. Okay, so now we're back to our animator. I'm gonna click and hold down on this again, and you'll see, wow, it really doesn't really go to green practically at all. This is based off of the fact that we have this 75% allowed exit time. If we change this to 1, we are now saying, and you can see this is sort of represented, this panel can be a little hard to read, but notice what happens when we change it from 75. We're seeing this line, we're seeing this overlap between down and default. We're seeing an overlap during the last 25% of the down state animation. So instead, when we change this to 1, you can see there's no overlap allowed. It has to fully complete the down state transition before it's allowed to move to the default state. And so now we see it much more clearly. We see the red, we see it go to green, and you'll notice here, this little bar representing the downstate transition, it goes full across the downstate before we're seeing it transition. This transition gets highlighted before we see it make that transition to the default state. So that is what exit time controls. How much of the original state has to be completed before we're allowed to start transitioning to the next state. Now beyond that, you have fixed duration and transition duration. This controls how long, when we're moving from our previous state to our next state, how long does it take to make that transition? You have 2 options here. Let me pull this out a little bit so you can see. If you say it's a fixed duration, it will provide you a value in seconds. If you say that it's not fixed, it provides you a value as a percent. So you can see if we say 0.5, and actually in this case, the percent and the seconds are going to be exactly the same because we have an animation of 1 second long. You can see when I set this to 1, this is 100% of the default. And I think actually The transition duration, this is a good question. Does the transition duration percentage represent the percentage of the state we're transitioning from or the state we're transitioning to? That's a good question. We'll have to set that up and find out. So what we're going to do to check that, we're going to take our button down. We're going to make this twice as long. We're going to drag these out to 120. So now, this is now a 2-second transition. You'll see that's much longer that we're holding. We're in the red for like a full 1.5 seconds or more, and then transitioning to green before we're done. So now, if we say, yeah, there you go. You can see here this transition duration. Yep. So the transition duration is based off of also the state that we are transitioning from. If we say that it's going to take 1%, that you can see here, it's showing it from 2 seconds to 4 seconds, which is the 2 seconds, the 2-second length of the down state animation, right? So this controls, you know, how long it takes to go from one to the other. If we want to allow an immediate transition, and so we'll see the different functionality here, right? So if we set this to 0.5, when we click down, you're gonna see it go green and then fade to white, right? Red, quick fade to green, slow fade to white. If we set this transition duration to 0, we're gonna see red, green, and then a snap to white. So there's really, so that can control, you know, how long does it take to transition from starting state into your ending state. Transition offset, this controls how much you're allowed. So like at this point, it would now ignore the first 50%. This is actually based off of the transition offset is based off of the state that you're transitioning to. You can see if we set this to 1, it moves the transition state all the way to the end there. If we send this to 0, it sets it all the way to the beginning. And if we set it to 0.5, it moves it halfway up. Lastly, you have the interruption source. This determines whether or not, rather than having to finish out the animation and sort of respecting the exit time and everything else, this determines whether or not you're allowed to exit an animation state early and be interrupted by another state request. Okay, so at this point, let's see, if we delete that transition, right? What we've got now is we're missing a transition for our button to get it back to normal via the normal route. Normal route being how the button wants to make transitions, which is through triggers, these triggers here. So I can call this default trigger. We need to add a trigger, which is the default trigger. We're going to make this transition. We're going to add default trigger as the condition. We can, of course, you can see like all of these same values, you know, this will apply to any transition coming from any state into our default state. So if you had specific rules that you needed to set up around transitioning from, you know, the let's say the highlight state, right? When we drag our mouse over the button, we enter the highlight state. When the button is down, we're in the down state. And when neither of those is happening, we're currently heading back to the default state. If you needed specific rules around transitioning from, from highlighted back to default, a different kind of condition than triggering from down to default, you would need to set up those conditions specifically, or those transitions specifically, rather than using the any state, because again, any state will apply to any state. So Now we've got our default trigger, which means that we should be able to click on this guy if we can get ourselves back to normal, right? What are we in preview again? Yeah, we're previewing. Okay, here we are. Down. It stays down, and I have to click off because, again, our buttons like to go to that selected state after we've pushed on them. When I click off of it, the default trigger is getting fired. You're not really able to see it. Again, it's happening very quickly. If we don't want this to be interrupted, okay, we would say it has an exit time. We would say the previous animation needs to finish fully before transitioning. And so now we'll watch it. There we go. There it is. That's much more clear. Okay, so now you can see when I click off of the button, you will notice the default trigger becomes active. And then, because my exit time is set to 1, when the down state has fully finished its animation, it will be allowed to transition to the default state. So click on it. I'm going to click on and rapidly off. There's that trigger. It's active. It is then allowed to move to the default state, and we see the trigger automatically deactivates once it makes that transition. So that is how these triggers work. That is how the button transition animation, these trigger values, these named values correlate to the names of trigger parameters, which are used as conditions to move between different states. Let's see, that's quite a bit. And so now you can see we only have 2 states here, right? And when we auto created that button, it brought in 5 states with 5 transitions, 5 triggers. There's a lot of setup there that it does automatically for you, which can be very helpful, but it's very easy to get lost very quickly because of how many wires it sets up on its own. So having this understanding is going to be of how these different triggers and things work, these animations, is going to be really useful for you when you start moving outside the realm of buttons and wanting to animate other components. So let's see, I can hit stop, and I think, luckily some of that stuff, okay, so some of the things that we changed on our animation component will stay. We were in play mode when we did all of those edits, right? Which is cool because my transitions, my animations, everything related to the assets in the project, all of those changes persisted through play mode. The things that didn't persist were the things on my component, which are the named triggers, right? This was default trigger, and this was down trigger. Okay. So now we've got those back. And at this point, I think what we probably want to show is, let's see, we did exit time, we did durations, interruptions, conditions, triggers. We can show really quickly this sort of condition. So, right, if we have a float condition or a float parameter, and we want to use that as a condition, you get different kinds of conditions. You can have greater than or less than. You don't even get an equal to, right? And if we have an int, I think the int maybe has the equal to option. For our integer trigger, or our integer condition, yes, greater, less, equal, not equal. And the Boolean, I'm pretty sure, is just a true, like, is it true or is it not true? The Boolean condition, new bool, true or false, right? So now you're able to stack these conditions. I'm going to go ahead and delete 2 of them. I'm going to delete the float and the int, and we'll just say that the down trigger and the new bool, these must both be true in order for us to make this transition. So now when we play and I push down, you can see the down trigger is going, but we're not making the transition. And that's because our bool is not true. If I turn on the bool, still nothing. If I now activate the down trigger, there we go. Both conditions were valid. It makes the transition. And as you'll see, the bool stays in whatever state it was. The trigger resets, the bool does not. Okay. All right, so just a real quick how to stack conditions to make more complex transitions. All right, animation override controllers. We are going to change our down animation. We're going to just have it go to red. We're going to get rid of all these other keyframes. So now we're just saying when you're going to the down state, switch it to red. Don't fade it to anything else. Just go straight to red. And we should be, let's just give that a quick test, make sure that we're seeing what we expect, which is, okay, so another interesting, back to kind of one of the things we talked about before, why are we seeing this fade? It's not actually going straight to red, it's fading to red. Well, that has to do with the duration, fixed duration. You can see it's overlapping from default into down, and during that overlap is where we're transitioning from the white default state to the red down state. If we say that that transition duration is 0, then we will go straight to red. And same thing for going back to white. If we say that that transition duration is 0, straight to red, straight back to white. Again, I have to click off of it to get that other trigger. So we're going to get out of play mode. I'm going to copy and paste this button. I'm going to create an animation override controller. Create animation animator override. You are able to override specific transitions, or actually specific, like the animation that is attached to a specific state is able to be overridden with a different state. So it will keep all of the properties of the transition on the original animator, but when it goes to that state, instead of the original animation, you can provide a different animation. So what we're going to do for this, you can see right now, these guys both are looking at the animator controller. Let me move them apart so we can actually see them. Minus 200, 200, all right. So these guys should both function identically right now. And they do. Okay. Button 1, button animator controller. I'm going to set this to be the new animator override controller. We can call this button animator override controller. There we are. So we are looking at the button animator override controller now. It needs a controller to override the original controller. And you'll see here, it gives us the button default and button down. So these are showing the names of the actions, the names of the motions associated with the different states of the animator controller. When we look at the button default motion, that one we want to keep the same. The button down motion, we want to have a different down animation what we're going to do is I'm going to copy and paste button down. I'm going to call the original one button down red. I'm going to call this one button down blue. I'm going to, here you can see that changed the value here because that animation is what we're seeing the name of. I'm going to override the button down red animation with the button down blue animation. I'm going to come into my button down blue animation. I'm going to set this to be a blue fill. You can preview this by clicking a button, clicking preview, and button down blue, preview, there it is. So now when I run this, we should see red and blue. And it is still leveraging the button default, right? For the sake of seeing it, right? Instead of going back to white, let's go ahead and set it to green. And we'll get rid of this other keyframe. Button default is now green. If I click on it, it goes to red. When I click off of it, it'll go back to green, right? The default state. This guy, click on it, goes to blue. Click off of it, goes back to green. So this is how we're able to leverage a single animator controller with the transition values that we set up, right? This transition logic doesn't need to be recreated. We can simply replace an animation that it's going to play when it would otherwise get to a certain state. We can replace the animation that it will play at that state. And so in this way, we're able to reuse certain, we were able to reuse the default state and all of the transitions that we set up between these two buttons. Now, this is not the only way that you can reuse animations. As long as the objects that you're trying to animate are have shared properties, then you can reuse an animation across those components. So to highlight this, what we're going to do is I'm going to create a non-button object. I'm going to create an image. We're going to move that up 100 pixels, no, 200 pixels, and we'll move it left by 100 pixels. I'm also going to create a text mesh pro item. We're going to move this right 100 pixels and up 200 pixels, right? Okay, new text, right? So now we've got a bunch of different components here, right? We've got 4 different components, all with different properties, right? What we do need on each of these is an animator. There it is down there, okay. Yep. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new animation controller. And this is going to be called a, we'll call this a scale up controller. It is going to be given a new state. We can really just call this default. We're not even going to have any transitions out of this state. We're just going to enter into this state once. We're going to create a new animation. New animation clip. We're going to call this scale up. And our animation panel. Okay. Again, in order to edit this, we need to actually have a component that we are able to work from. So in order to do that, we can select these 2 components. We're going to add the scale up controller to these components. Now we're looking at this, and we're going to add the scale up animation as the motion, and now we're able to edit it. So you'll notice whichever object we have selected, we're going to be seeing the properties for that object, you know, the components and all of that. We see the rect transform and the text mesh pro component on the image, or on the text. We see the rect transform and the image component on the image. You know, if we try to change the image color when we go to this animation, when we enter, right, we'll get rid of that second one. We're going to say go to a we'll say go to gray, right? We'll do a 0.5 on all of these, right? If I go over to my text and my animation again, you can see it tells us that it is missing this property. The image color property doesn't exist on this object because it doesn't have an image component. If we add an image component, oh, we can't add it because there's a text mesh pro. If we remove the text mesh pro and add an image component, you should see now it says, okay, that's fine. I know how to do that. And we should be seeing in our scale up preview, this guy preview, we're now seeing both of them, right? They both will enter into this gray state when we boot up. So again, I'm going to remove the image component, add the text mesh pro UI component back, and give it some values, new text, right? So again, now we're going to run into this problem where these fields, they don't exist on both. Only the image component has its color changed by this animation. So when is this useful, right? Like most of these things are different. Well, for rect transforms, which exist on any game object in your canvas is going to have a rect transform. So when we're doing animations that affect rect transforms, we're able to reuse those animations for multiple game objects throughout the project, such as a scale. So initially, right, we have our scale up animation. We're saying that when we enter, we're going to start at a scale of 0. We're going to scale up. Let's see, we need to go to 1 second's worth. There we are. Okay, cool. We're going from 0 to 1. You can see it's already previewing in my game here. And when I go to my image and I preview it, it's working there as well. And so now you'll see when I enter into here, both of these, even though they're different game objects with different components, because they share the rect transform component, they're both able to use a animation controller that affects the rect transform property of these two different game objects. And we can, in terms of applying that across to everything else, if we go to our button animator controller, and if we, as part of our default state, let's see, if we change this, I think actually what we could do here is if we add a new layer, create a state, and add the scale up motion to this default state. Again, this is a new layer inside of the button animators. Now, these layers are both going to happen simultaneously, and at entry, we're going to go through the scale up animation process. And now everybody in our scene, oh, now that's very interesting. Why does that not work? I expected, wait. Oh, okay, so this is weighting the different, okay, that's why. Now that I've set the weight to 1, there we are. Now we are seeing everybody leveraging that one animation through their states and the animator controllers. Alrighty, that was a lot. We covered pretty much everything that there is to cover in terms of animating your buttons, sharing animations, how to trigger different animations. I guess the one thing that we didn't do was activate these things ourselves through code, which is, I guess, what we will do next. So let's take a quick peek over into our code. Okay, so what we will do last is to demonstrate how to work with these parameters through code, through mono behaviors that we have written that we attach to game objects. So what I will do to start is let's change the condition on this transition. I'm going to go back to our previous transition, which said that not only does the trigger have to be true, but this new bool value has to be true. And I'm going to go ahead and just clean things up a little bit. I'm going to get rid of the float. I'm going to get rid of the int. Okay, so now we're back to saying new bool has to be true and the down trigger has to be active. I'm going to jump back to the button components. So right now we have our button listener script and we have our animator component on the buttons. If we jump over to the code, okay, so here is our button listener script. We need to access the animator component in order to work with the parameters of that of the transitions and of that component. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a public animator. Okay, save that, recompile. When we come back over to our buttons, we should see an animator field pop up here under the button listener that we'll be able to add to. There it is. We can just drag the component, and actually, I guess what I'll do is I will apply all of these changes to the button script. That way or the button prefab. So, and I can revert this one, revert all. All right. So now I've got my two buttons, two instances of my button prefab. They have the animator component on them, and they have the animator component assigned to the animator field that I created on my button listener script. So this will be set at runtime or at compile time. This reference has already been set, so we have access to our animator. What we're going to say is animator dot. Okay, so from here we have some options. All right, the set. There's a few different set methods to work with the different parameters of our animator. You can see we have set bool, set float, set integer, and set trigger. Those obviously correlate to the different parameter types that you can create in your animator controller. Based off of which one you're doing, you can, for a bool, you can see the string name. All right, so the name is the parameter name. It needs to match whatever you have called this parameter in your project here. So for us, this is just called new bool. So that's the name of the parameter, and set bool value, we can start it true. All right, so now when the buttons run their start method on startup, we are going to set the bool param new bool to true. And if we look over here, when we run this, we'll see this bool, the new bool checkbox, will become checked at startup. There we go. And because it's part of this condition, we are able to make those transitions. So you are able to do this for all of your types. If you are setting the trigger, the only thing that you can provide is the name. You can only turn a trigger on. You cannot turn a trigger off. If you are setting the float, you have options for, again, the name of the float and the float value, and same thing for set int, set integer. You get the name and the name of the param and the integer value that you would like to set it to. And okay, so that's how you can work with the parameters of the animator component from code. So, this allows us to work with, certain like other game logic to determine when a particular animation should run based off of particular conditions being fulfilled. Okay, I think that should cover just about everything that you need to really dive deep into animations, particularly button animations, but really any game object, any canvas component. It's a really complex topic. There's a lot to learn. So, again, if you're feeling overwhelmed with the amount of information, don't worry. The more that you practice this, and particularly the more that you practice setting these things up from scratch, once you really get a handle on it, then going through the automated button creation process, can save you time for button animations in particular. All right, well, thank you very much for joining, and see you next week.